Today's story is about something so small, so simple, that most people completely overlook it. Yet, the great mystic Padre Pio said that this tiny act could move the very heart of heaven. We are talking about the power of one single Hail Mary. Padre Pio saw things that ordinary people never see: souls, angels, and grace moving invisibly through the world. But among all the miracles he witnessed, few things surprised him as much as the power hidden inside this one short prayer. Before we unlock this spiritual secret, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue to share these powerful stories of faith. Now, let's discover why Padre Pio said that if you truly understood the value of a single Hail Mary, you would recite nothing else for the rest of your life. The wind in San Giovanni Rotondo does not simply blow, it scours. It moves through the rocky hills of the Gargano promontory like an ancient memory, stripping away everything that is not essential, leaving only the stone and the soul. It was 1947. The war had ended 2 years prior, but for men like Thomas, the noise of the cannons had never truly stopped. He had come to Italy looking for a story, or perhaps looking for a reason to believe that the world was not entirely broken. He had heard the whispers about the Capuchin friar living in this remote monastery. People said he bore the wounds on his hands. People said he could read hearts. People said he was a saint. Thomas was a man of facts, and he came armed with skepticism. He climbed the winding, dusty road to the monastery, his leather boots crunching against the dry earth. The air here was thin and cold. It smelled of crushed wild herbs and old incense. When he finally entered the small, dimly lit church, he expected a spectacle. He expected a man preaching with fire in his eyes, commanding the masses, but he found only silence. In the shadows of the altar, a figure knelt. The friar was older, his shoulders hunched under the weight of a rough brown wool habit. He was utterly still, like a statue carved from the mountain itself. Thomas watched from the back of the nave. He saw the friar's hands. They were covered in half gloves, fingerless, exposing the tips. But even from this distance, Thomas could see the trembling. It was not the shaking of fear. It was the trembling of a man holding a weight too heavy for human muscles to bear. For an hour the friar did not move. He did not speak. He simply existed in that space between the visible and the invisible. Thomas looked around. He saw the faces of the locals, women with scarves covering their heads, old men with weather-beaten skin. They were not looking at the friar with curiosity. They were looking at him with a desperate, hungry love. They knew something Thomas did not. Later, Thomas would learn that this man, Padre Pio, believed that the world was held together not by politicians or treaties, but by the invisible threads of prayer. But on this first day, all Thomas saw was a man in pain. As the evening bells began to toll, echoing down the valley, the friar slowly stood up. He winced. Every movement seemed to cost him something. As he turned to leave the altar, his eyes swept across the few people gathered there. For a fleeting second, Thomas felt that gaze land on him. It was not a look of judgment. It was a look of profound, exhausting recognition. It was the look of a soldier, seeing another soldier on a different kind of battlefield. Padre Pio once said that if we truly understood the value of a single prayer, we would do nothing else but pray for the rest of our lives. Thomas did not know it yet, but he had just stepped into a school where the only lesson was love, and the only textbook was a string of simple beads. The friar disappeared into the sacristy, but the atmosphere in the church remained heavy, charged with a silent electricity. Thomas reached into his pocket and touched the cold metal of his lighter, a habit from the trenches. But then his fingers brushed against something else, a small forgotten rosary his mother had given him before he shipped out. He had not touched it in years. But here, in the silence of San Giovanni, the beads felt suddenly warm. The story of the single Hail Mary was about to begin, not with a shout, but with a whisper that would eventually shake the foundations of heaven. The monastery library was a place where time seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with the scent of dust and aging parchment, a smell that Thomas found strangely comforting. It reminded him of the university libraries back home, before the world had turned upside down. He sat across from Brother Antonio, a friar with a face as wrinkled as a dried walnut but eyes that held a surprising amount of light. Thomas had his notebook open, but his pen hovered above the paper. He was trying to understand the man they called Padre Pio. The stories he had heard in the village below were fantastic, bordering on the unbelievable. They spoke of bilocation and healing, but Thomas was not interested in magic tricks. He was interested in the human element. He wanted to know what burdened the man. Brother Antonio folded his hands inside his sleeves. He spoke softly, his voice barely rising above the sound of the wind rattling the window pane. I remember one evening very clearly, the friar began. It was during the quiet hours. Padre Pio was in the choir. Thomas leaned forward. He knew the choir was the place where the friars gathered for prayer, a secluded area behind the main altar. He was praying before the Blessed Sacrament, Antonio continued. It was a routine we all followed, silence, contemplation. Usually, Padre Pio would be lost in deep meditation, his head bowed. But on this night, something shifted. According to the friar, the atmosphere in the room changed abruptly. It was not a sound, but a pressure, as if the air itself had become heavy. I was watching him, Antonio said. Suddenly, his face changed. All the color drained from his skin. He grew pale, and his eyes filled with tears. Thomas wrote down the words "pale and tears." He looked up. Was he in pain? No, Antonio shook his head. It was not pain, it was recognition. He looked up and stared directly into an empty corner of the chapel. Thomas glanced at the stone wall of the library. He tried to imagine the scene. A grown man, a respected spiritual leader, staring at nothing. He looked as if someone was standing there, Antonio whispered. He was interacting with a presence that none of us could see. His expression was one of profound shock, and then deep humility. What happened next? Thomas asked. He stayed like that for a moment, transfixed. Then he nodded slowly, as if listening to a message. When the moment passed, he slumped forward slightly, letting out a long breath. I approached him afterward. I had to know. I asked him gently, "Father, what did you see?" The friar paused, his gaze drifting to the window. And Thomas pressed. Padre Pio answered me simply. He said, "A soul from purgatory." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty room. Purgatory, the place of waiting, the place of purification. He told me the soul had come to thank him, Antonio said. It came to thank him for a single Hail Mary offered long ago. Thomas frowned. A single prayer? That seemed too simple. People prayed thousands of times a day in this place. Why would one specific prayer warrant a visit from the dead? That is what I asked him, Antonio said, anticipating the question. But then Padre Pio said something I will never forget. He said the soul had forgotten the prayer, but heaven had not. The friar leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Padre Pio explained that earlier that day, he had been walking through the courtyard. He was busy. His mind was crowded with the needs of the hospital, the letters, the confessions. While walking, he had whispered a distracted Hail Mary for someone who needed help. Distracted? Thomas repeated. Yes. No name, no specific details, no deep mystical intention, just a simple impulse of charity. He barely thought about it. It was a fleeting moment, a breath of words thrown into the wind. Thomas sat back. He had always been taught that prayer required total focus. He thought it required a clear mind and a pure heart, things he felt he no longer possessed. And that worked? Thomas asked skeptically. Brother Antonio smiled, a sad, knowing smile. That one prayer, simple and small, had become the very thing that pushed a suffering soul into the light of heaven. Padre Pio told me the soul showed him the moment the prayer touched him. Thomas waited. He needed to understand the mechanics of this grace. He said it was like a drop of cool water falling onto burning coals. The image was vivid. Thomas could almost hear the hiss of the steam. He felt relief, Antonio continued. Not just relief from punishment, but relief from the sorrow of being far from God. That was the true pain, you see, the separation. And that little, distracted prayer bridged the gap. Thomas looked down at his notebook. The ink seemed to blur. He had come here looking for a complex theological system, a way to explain the suffering he had seen during the war. Instead, he was being told that a mumbled sentence could save a soul. It changed the way Padre Pio spoke about small prayers after that, Antonio said, closing his eyes. He began telling his spiritual children that no prayer is ever lost. Even the weak ones? Thomas asked, thinking of his own hollow attempts at faith. Especially those, Antonio replied firm, even if it feels weak or distracted, because the listening ear of God is not seeking eloquence, he is seeking the heart. The courtyard of the monastery was bathed in the harsh, bright light of the Italian afternoon. The stone pavers were uneven, worn smooth by centuries of sandals shuffling across them in silent rhythm. Thomas stood by the central well, watching the friars move back and forth. He was trying to process the conversation with Brother Antonio. The idea of the drop of water had stuck in his mind. It was a tactile image, something he could feel. During the war, Thomas had known thirst. He knew the way the tongue swelled and the throat closed up when water was scarce. He knew that when a man was truly thirsty, he did not care if the water came from a crystal goblet or a muddy tin cup. He just wanted to drink. Was God like that? Was the thirst of the souls in purgatory so great that even a drop from a distracted man like him could bring relief? He watched Padre Pio emerge from the side door. The friar was walking slowly, his hands covered in his usual half-gloves to hide the wounds. He looked tired. His shoulders were rounded, carrying a burden that seemed to press him down toward the earth. Thomas followed at a distance. He watched as Pio stopped near a rosebush. The friar's lips were moving. It was a constant, rhythmic motion. Hail Mary, full of grace. Thomas could not hear the words, but he knew the rhythm. Padre Pio prayed the Hail Mary constantly while walking, while resting, even while in pain. It was not a performance. It was as natural to him as breathing. Thomas decided to try it. He stood in the shadow of an olive tree and closed his eyes. He tried to summon the face of a friend he had lost in the Ardennes, a young man named Michael who had laughed loud and died quiet. Hail Mary, Thomas whispered. He waited for a feeling. He waited for a sense of connection, a warmth, anything. But he felt only the heat of the sun on his neck and the dry itch of his collar. His mind wandered immediately. He thought about his deadline for the article. He thought about the train schedule back to Rome. He thought about the pack of cigarettes in his pocket. He stopped. It was useless. His mind was too fractured. He was too distracted. He opened his eyes and saw that Padre Pio had stopped walking. The friar was looking in his direction, though not directly at him. Pio was speaking to a woman who had approached him, clutching a photograph of a soldier. Thomas moved closer, pretending to inspect the architecture, but straining his ears to listen. Father, the woman wept. I try to pray, but I am so worried. My mind goes in circles. I fear my prayers are just noise. Thomas froze. She was voicing his exact thought. Padre Pio looked at her with an intensity that was almost frightening. He did not offer platitudes. He did not tell her to try harder. He said, "The Hail Mary is like placing a candle in the hands of the Virgin." The woman sniffled, looking up at him. "She decides where the light is most needed," Pio continued, his voice raspy but firm. "But I feel nothing," the woman confessed. "I am so tired." Padre Pio reached out and tapped the photograph she held with a bandaged finger. Even when we feel nothing, even when we are tired or distracted or discouraged, Our Lady hears the intention behind the prayer, not the quality of the words. He leaned in closer to her. "Do not pray only when you feel holy," he said. "Pray especially when you feel weak." Thomas felt the words hit him like a physical blow. Pray especially when you feel weak. He had spent 2 years waiting to feel strong enough to talk to God again. He had thought faith was a muscle he had to rebuild before he could use it. "Those are the Hail Marys that save souls," Pio finished. The woman nodded, wiping her eyes. She seemed lighter, as if the permission to be weak had given her strength. Thomas walked away from the olive tree. He went back to the stone well. He looked down into the darkness of the shaft. He thought of the soul in the corner of the choir. That soul had been burning with the sorrow of separation. It had not needed a symphony. It had needed a drop of water. Thomas took a breath. He did not try to clear his mind. He did not try to force a feeling of holiness. He simply let the image of Michael rise in his mind, along with all the noise and static of his own doubt. "Hail Mary," he whispered into the well. It was a weak prayer. It was distracted. It was broken. But for the first time, Thomas understood that the water does not need to be perfect to cool the coals. It just needs to be offered. He looked across the courtyard. Padre Pio was moving on, his lips still moving, weaving a rope of words that Thomas was only just beginning to see. The friar had said that the prayer was not just words, but an act of handing your heart to the Mother of God. Thomas touched his chest. His heart was heavy, scarred, and tired. But perhaps, he realized, that was exactly the kind of heart that heaven could use. The village of San Giovanni Rotondo was not merely a backdrop for the monastery. It was a living, breathing organism that suffered alongside the friars. The war had left deep scars here. There were fewer young men in the streets, and the women wore black so often that it seemed to be a uniform woven from shadows. Thomas sat on a low stone wall near the vegetable gardens, watching the daily rhythm of the place. He was observing a woman named Maria. She was not a figure of importance in the eyes of the world. She was a widow who spent her days scrubbing the stone floors of the pilgrim hostels and washing the linens of the sick. Her hands were red and cracked from lye soap and cold water. Thomas had spoken to her briefly the day before. She had told him, with eyes cast down, that she felt her prayers were useless. She was too tired to focus. She fell asleep during the rosary. She worried that her fatigue was an insult to God. On this afternoon, the sky was a bruised purple, threatening rain. Maria was kneeling by the public fountain, scrubbing a heavy wool blanket. Padre Pio was passing through the garden, supported by 2 other friars. He moved slowly, his feet shuffling on the gravel. When he saw Maria, he stopped. The other friars tried to urge him forward, concerned for his health, but he planted his feet firmly. He looked at the woman with an expression of intense compassion. Maria looked up, startled. She wiped her wet hands on her apron and bowed her head, ashamed of her poverty and her exhaustion. "Father," she whispered, "I am sorry. I have no offering." Thomas moved closer, his journalist instincts taking over, though he kept a respectful distance. He wanted to hear how the saint would address the worker. Padre Pio leaned against the stone basin of the fountain. His voice was weak, but it carried through the still air with perfect clarity. "Why do you apologize, my child?" he asked. "Because I am empty," Maria replied, her voice trembling. "I try to pray, but my mind wanders to the price of bread or the ache in my back. I offer the Virgin nothing but dust." Thomas watched Pio's face. He expected a rebuke, or perhaps an instruction to fast and do penance. Instead, the friar smiled. It was a warm, earthy smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Listen to me," Padre Pio said. He lifted one of his wounded hands, gesturing vaguely toward the sky. "The Hail Mary is not a tax you pay to a demanding king. It is a gift." Maria looked up, confused. He explained it this way. "The Hail Mary is like placing a candle in the hands of the Virgin." Thomas wrote the phrase in his notebook, "a candle in the hands of the Virgin." "When you give a candle to a friend, do you tell them where to put it?" Pio asked. "No, you trust them. You place the candle in the hands of Our Lady, and she decides where the light is most needed." "But my candle is dim," Maria protested. "It flickers. It is barely a spark." Padre Pio shook his head. Padre Pio insisted that even when we feel nothing, even when we are tired or distracted or discouraged, Our Lady hears the intention behind the prayer, not the quality of the words. He took a step closer to her. "Do not pray only when you feel holy," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that Thomas had to strain to hear. "Pray especially when you feel weak." Maria stared at him. The concept seemed to overturn everything she had been taught about religious perfection. "Those are the Hail Marys that save souls," Pio said. "The ones offered from the bottom of the well, the ones offered when the heart is dry." He blessed her and continued on his way toward the monastery. Thomas stayed behind, watching Maria. She stood there for a long time, staring at her red, swollen hands. Then she knelt back down to the wet stone. She picked up the heavy blanket and began to scrub again. But something had changed. The frantic, desperate tension in her shoulders was gone. She began to move with a rhythmic, peaceful cadence. Thomas saw her lips moving. She was not chanting loud, impressive psalms. She was whispering the simple words over and over again, while the dirty water swirled around her wrists. Thomas realized he was witnessing a transformation. The scrubbing was no longer just labor. It had become a liturgy. She was placing small, flickering candles into invisible hands, trusting that they would be carried to places she could not see. The following morning brought a different kind of pilgrim to the mountain. A black sedan, polished and out of place on the dusty roads, pulled up to the monastery gates. A woman stepped out. She was dressed in fine silk and wore a veil of expensive lace, but her wealth could not conceal the devastation in her eyes. Her name was Elena, and she carried the heavy burden of a survivor. Thomas learned later that her mother had died during the chaotic years of the occupation, alone and without the last rites. Elena was tormented by the fear that her mother was lost, wandering in the dark because she, the daughter, had not been there to pray for her at the final hour. The line for the confessional was long, winding through the nave of the church like a slow river of regret. Thomas observed Elena as she waited. She twisted a handkerchief in her hands, her knuckles white. She looked like a woman waiting for a verdict. Hours passed. When it was finally her turn, she entered the wooden box. Thomas sat in a pew nearby, pretending to read a missal. He could not hear the confession, of course, that was sealed by the sacrament, but he could hear the tone of the voices. He heard the woman sobbing, a sound of pure heartbreak, and then he heard the low, murmuring rumble of Padre Pio. Suddenly, the door of the confessional opened. Padre Pio did not usually look out, but today he leaned forward. He looked over the head of the penitent, his face filled with surprise. Thomas watched closely. The friar's expression was not one of judgment. It was the look of someone who had just been given a gift. After a moment he smiled gently, something he rarely did inside the confessional. He whispered loud enough for the silence of the church to carry the words, "Go in peace, your mother is in glory." The woman, Elena, burst into tears. She fell to her knees right there on the stone floor. "But Father," she gasped. "How? I did not pray enough." She died alone. The friars who were attending the line stepped forward to help her up, but Pio raised a hand to stop them. He wanted her to hear the explanation. He said, "I saw her mother's soul. She said she entered heaven because her daughter once prayed a single Hail Mary for her on a day when she felt alone." Elena looked up, confused. She shook her head. "I do not remember," she said. "I failed her." Padre Pio replied with absolute certainty. When she was a child, she prayed it without thinking. A simple prayer of love, but heaven kept it. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. He thought of his own childhood, of the prayers he had rattled off before sleep, thinking they meant nothing. That was the mystery, Pio continued. A forgotten prayer from childhood had become the ladder that lifted her mother into paradise. Elena covered her face with her hands, weeping. But these were no longer tears of despair. They were tears of release. The crushing weight of guilt was evaporating in the light of this impossible mercy. Padre Pio waited for her to calm down. He spoke to the room at large, as if teaching a lesson to the very stones of the church. "Grace is not measured by size, but by love," he said. "A grain of wheat becomes bread. A drop of water becomes life. A single Hail Mary becomes salvation." He retreated back into the shadows of the confessional, the velvet curtain sliding shut. Elena stood up. She walked past Thomas, and he saw her face. It was the face of someone who had been drowning and had just broken the surface of the water to breathe air again. Thomas looked down at his notebook. He had written the word ladder. He circled it. He realized that Padre Pio was describing a spiritual economy that made no sense to the rational mind. In the world of men, value was determined by effort, by quantity, by gold. But in the world Pio saw, a mumbled prayer from a 6-year-old child could outweigh a lifetime of mistakes. It meant that nothing was ever truly lost. Every whisper, every thought directed toward the divine was stored away in some invisible treasury, waiting for the moment it would be needed most. Thomas left the church and walked out into the bright sunlight. He looked at the mountains in the distance. He wondered if his own mother, thousands of miles away in America, was safe. He wondered if the prayers she had said for him when he was a boy were the reason he had survived the shrapnel in the trenches. He reached into his pocket and found his rosary. He did not pray it yet, he just held it, feeling the wooden beads. They felt different now. They no longer felt like dead wood. They felt like seeds, waiting to be planted in the soil of a mercy he was just beginning to comprehend. The evening air in San Giovanni Rotondo was cooling rapidly as the sun dipped below the rocky horizon. Thomas sat at a small wooden table outside a local tavern. a glass of dark red wine untouched before him. Across from him sat a man named Marco. Marco was not a friar. He was a man of the earth, with rough hands and a face that had aged faster than his years. He was a veteran of the war, just like Thomas. They had fought on opposite sides of the conflict, but here, in the shadow of the monastery, that distinction had dissolved into the shared brotherhood of survival. Marco stared into his own glass, swirling the liquid slowly. He had agreed to speak with Thomas, because he knew that Thomas was writing about Padre Pio. "You want to know about miracles," Marco said, his voice gravelly and low. "People come here looking for cured legs and restored sight. But the greatest miracle is that I am sitting in this chair breathing this air." Thomas opened his notebook. He did not write immediately. He simply nodded, encouraging the man to continue. "It was 1943, Marco began. We were in the mountains. It was winter. The cold was worse than the enemy fire. It bit into your bones until you could not feel your own fingers on the equipment." Marco paused, his eyes losing focus as he drifted back to a place Thomas knew well. It was the 1,000-yard stare, the look of a man seeing ghosts. "We were ambushed," Marco said. "The shelling started without warning. The earth shook so violently that the trees snapped like dry twigs. The noise was not a sound you heard with your ears. It was a pressure that slammed into your chest." Thomas kept his pen still. He knew the policy of silence that soldiers often kept. He knew that describing the graphic details of war did no good. It was the internal experience that mattered. "I was alone in a foxhole," Marco continued. "The world was ending around me. Dust and smoke had turned the day into night. I knew I was going to die. There was no way out. My unit was scattered. The ground was erupting." He took a sip of wine, his hand trembling slightly. "I was not a religious man, Thomas. I had stopped going to Mass years before. I thought God had forgotten us. But in that moment, as the dirt rained down on my helmet, something instinctive took over. I did not think. I did not reflect. I just screamed." Marco looked up at Thomas, his eyes intense. "I shouted, 'Hail Mary, help me.'" He let the words hang in the air. "I did not say it with devotion, I shouted it with terror. It was a scream of panic. It was the sound of an animal caught in a trap." "And you survived," Thomas said softly. Marco nodded. "I survived. Many others did not. For years that guilt ate at me. I felt like a fraud. Why did I live? Was it because I prayed? But it was not a real prayer. It was fear. I felt that God should have been offended by such a cowardly plea." Marco leaned forward. "So, when I came to San Giovanni Rotondo after the war, I confessed this to Padre Pio. I told him everything. I told him that I was ashamed, that my only prayer was born of panic. I told him I felt unworthy of the life I had been given." Thomas finally began to write. This was the heart of the story. "Padre Pio listened to me quietly," Marco said. He did not interrupt. "When I was finished, he looked at me with those dark, piercing eyes. He asked me, 'Do you know why you are still alive?' Marco shook his head. He told me, 'Because your cry called your mother.'" Thomas wrote down the phrase, "Because your cry called your mother." "I asked him if God listens to prayers born of panic," Marco said. "I asked him if such a prayer even counts. Padre Pio answered me immediately. He said, 'Especially those. Panic is simply the heart breaking open.'" Thomas stopped writing. The image was powerful. The breaking of the heart was not a figure of speech. It was the necessary condition for grace to enter. He believed that the simplest Hail Mary said in the darkest moment becomes the brightest flame in heaven, Marco whispered, because it comes from honest need, not pride. Marco finished his wine. He looked less burdened now, as if retelling the story had lightened the weight he carried. "He told me that a Hail Mary said in fear is still a Hail Mary," Marco said. "The Virgin does not check your pulse to see if you are calm before she comes. She just comes." Thomas looked out at the darkened street. He thought of the times he had been afraid, the times he had been too proud to scream. He realized now that his pride had been a barrier. Marco had survived because he had allowed himself to be a child crying for help. "Padre Pio was right," Marco said, standing up to leave. "The prayer saved my body in the mountains, but his words about the prayer saved my soul here in the village." Thomas watched the veteran walk away into the night. He realized that the story of the Hail Mary was not just about gentle piety in a quiet church. It was a shield for the desperate. It was a shield for the terrified. It was the final defense when all other defenses had failed. The next morning, Thomas found himself sitting in the back of the old church again. The air was filled with the murmuring sound of the rosary being prayed by a group of local women. It was a rhythmic, rolling sound like the tide coming in and going out. Hail Mary, full of grace. Holy Mary, Mother of God. Thomas closed his eyes and listened. For a long time he had viewed this repetition as mindless. He had thought it was a way for people to numb themselves, a kind of spiritual hypnosis. But after his conversation with Marco, he began to hear it differently. He began to see the structure of the prayer. It was not a random collection of words. It was a vehicle. Later that day, Thomas had the opportunity to speak with a young friar named Brother Leo, who was often seen assisting Padre Pio during the midday meal. Brother Leo was a scholar, a man who loved books and theology, but he spoke of Padre Pio with the reverence of a student watching a master. Thomas asked him about the mechanics of the prayer. Why that specific prayer? Why repeat it? Brother Leo sat with Thomas on a stone bench in the monastery garden. He held a rosary in his hands, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the beads. Padre Pio teaches that the power of the Hail Mary comes from the name at its center, Brother Leo explained. He held up the rosary, letting it dangle. The prayer has two halves, Leo said. The first half is the greeting of the angel. The second half is the petition of the church. But right in the middle, like a hinge, is the name Jesus. Thomas nodded. And blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Padre Pio says that many people rush past that name, Leo said. They treat it like a comma. But for him, the name is the destination. The rest of the prayer is just the setting for that one jewel. Leo looked at the beads. He explained it to us once using a metaphor that I find very helpful. He said the prayer is like a thread. A thread? Thomas asked. Yes. Imagine a long, golden thread. Padre Pio said that Mary holds one end of this thread, and Jesus holds the other. The image formed in the mind of Thomas. It was a connection between the mother and the son. And where are we? Thomas asked. The soul clings to the middle, Leo answered, smiling. Thomas looked at the rosary in the hands of the friar. It was a simple physical object, but in the vision of Padre Pio, it was a lifeline. When you pray the Hail Mary, you are gripping that thread, Leo continued. Even if you are weak, even if you are falling, as long as you keep saying the prayer, you are holding on to the bond between Mary and Jesus. You cannot be lost if you are holding the thread that connects them. Thomas thought of the rope metaphors used by sailors and mountaineers. A rope did not need to understand the person it was saving. It just needed to be strong. Padre Pio told us that the rosary is like a rope thrown into the hearts of those sinking, Leo said. He said that every Hail Mary is one more knot, making the rope longer, stronger, easier to grasp. Thomas wrote in his notebook, "The rosary is a rope for the sinking." This explained the persistence of Padre Pio. It explained why the old friar prayed constantly, his lips moving even when he was half asleep. He was not just reciting poetry, he was weaving. He was knitting a safety net for the world, one knot at a time. Brother Leo leaned back against the warm stone wall. He also said something else that might interest you, Thomas. He said that Mary never forgets a soul who remembers her, even in a whisper. Even in a whisper, Thomas repeated. Yes, because the prayer unites us with her humility. She was the woman who said yes to God on behalf of all humanity. When we say her prayer, we are borrowing her yes. We are borrowing her faith because our own is often too small. Thomas looked at the other friars walking in the garden. They were men of simple habits, but they were engaged in a work that they believed shifted the balance of the universe. Padre Pio calls her the treasurer, Leo added. The treasurer? Yes. He says she collects our prayers. She keeps every Hail Mary. She knows we are poor. She knows we often do not have the currency of great virtues or heroic deeds. So she takes our small coins, our little prayers, and she invests them for us. Thomas looked down at his own hands. They were empty of miracles. They were empty of great deeds, but they were capable of holding a set of beads. He realized then that the logic of the Hail Mary was the logic of rescue. You did not need to be strong to be rescued. You just needed to reach out and grab the rope. As the bell tower rang out the hour, echoing across the valley, Thomas felt a shift in his understanding. He had come looking for a biography of a man. He was finding a map of the spiritual world. And on that map, the path out of the darkness was marked by a trail of small, simple beads, leading one by one toward the light. He thanked Brother Leo and walked back toward the church. He wanted to sit in the back again. He wanted to listen to the sound of the rope being woven, knot by the voices of the faithful. He wanted to see if he could find his own place on the thread. The news traveled through the village of San Giovanni Rotondo faster than the winter wind. Pietro was dying. Pietro was not a friend of the monastery. He was a man who had spent the last 40 years of his life building walls against God. He was known in the local taverns for his sharp tongue and his bitterness. He would often mock the pilgrims who climbed the hill to see Padre Pio, calling them sheep following a ghost. Thomas heard about the situation from the innkeeper. The village was small, and the spiritual state of a soul was considered public business. He is refusing the priest, the innkeeper told Thomas, shaking his head while wiping down the counter. His family is terrified. They fear he will depart this life in anger. Thomas decided to walk to the house of Pietro. He did not go to intrude, but to witness. He wanted to see if the reach of Padre Pio extended to those who actively pushed him away. The house was small and smelled of old wood and medicine. Outside, a young woman was weeping softly. It was the daughter of Pietro. She had just returned from the monastery where she had gone to beg for help. Thomas stood by the gate, observing. He saw a local priest exit the house, his head bowed in defeat. Pietro had turned him away. The old man had shouted that he wanted no rituals, no incense, and no prayers. He wanted to end his life as he had lived it, alone and defiant. Inside the monastery, a different scene was unfolding. The daughter had managed to speak to Padre Pio before returning home. She had fallen at his feet, sobbing that her father was hardening his heart at the very end. Padre Pio had listened to her. He did not rush to the house. He did not put on his cloak to perform a dramatic intervention. Instead, he sat in his cell. Thomas later learned the details from Brother Leo. Padre Pio sat on his chair, his head buried in his hands. He was not preparing a sermon. He was preparing a spiritual defense. But this weapon was made of silence and love. He began to pray, "Hail Mary, full of grace." Padre Pio once said that one Hail Mary can soften a heart at the last breath. He believed that this simple prayer had the power to slip through the cracks of a fortress that seemed impenetrable. He prayed for Pietro. He did not ask for the man to be punished for his mockery. He asked the Virgin to intervene. He asked her to touch the soul that had pushed God away for its entire life. Back at the house, the atmosphere was heavy with despair. Pietro lay in his bed, his breathing shallow and raspy. His face was set in a grimace of pain and stubbornness. He looked at the ceiling as if it were an enemy. The family waited in the hallway, afraid to enter. They thought it was over. They thought the darkness had won. But then, the silence in the room shifted. It was not a sound. It was a change in the air pressure. It was as if a window had been opened in a room that had been sealed for decades. Thomas, standing outside by the open window, heard a sound that stopped his heart. It was the voice of Pietro. But it was not the angry, shouting voice the village knew. It was the voice of a frightened child. "Mother," the old man whispered, "help me." The daughter ran into the room. She found her father crying. The bitterness that had etched lines into his face for 40 years was gone. It had been washed away. "Get the priest," Pietro gasped, reaching out his hand. The local priest was called back. He entered the room and closed the door. Pietro made his confession. He reconciled with the God he had fought for so long. An hour later, Pietro died. He died in peace, holding a small crucifix that his daughter had placed in his hands. Thomas walked back to the monastery as the sun began to set. He found Brother Leo in the garden. He asked for a priest, Thomas said, still stunned by the turnaround. He whispered to a mother he claimed not to believe in. Brother Leo nodded. He did not look surprised. "Padre Pio told us what happened," Leo said softly. He said, "It was not my prayer, it was Mary standing in the presence of the Hail Mary." Thomas looked at the stone walls of the friary. He realized that while Pietro lay dying, a battle had been fought. It was not fought with arguments or theology. It was fought with a single prayer whispered in a cell a mile away. Padre Pio insisted that the Hail Mary is not just a devotional phrase, Leo added. It is a spiritual force. A soul cannot remain the same after a Hail Mary touches it. It either rises or it trembles. Thomas wrote in his notebook that night. He wrote about the power of soft things. Water wears away stone. A whisper cuts through noise. And a simple prayer offered by a stranger can break the chains of a lifetime of anger. The death of Pietro stayed with Thomas for a long time. It forced him to confront his own anxieties about time. Thomas was a man who measured his life in deadlines and lost opportunities. He looked back at the years of the war as a black hole, a void where nothing good had grown. He sat in his small rented room in the village, the light of a kerosene lamp flickering on his desk. He was trying to write a letter to his sister in America, but the words felt heavy. He felt that he had wasted too much time being angry, being afraid, being distant. The next day he sought out Padre Pio. He found the friar sitting in the sacristy, resting after the long morning mass. The old man looked exhausted, yet his eyes were alert, scanning the invisible world that Thomas was only just beginning to sense. Thomas sat on a wooden stool nearby. "Father," Thomas asked quietly, "does it matter when we pray?" Padre Pio looked at him. "What do you mean, my son?" "I feel that I have wasted years," Thomas confessed. "I feel that I should have prayed for my friends when they were dying, but I did not. Now they are gone. Is it too late?" Padre Pio shook his head slowly. The movement was gentle, like a father correcting a confused child. "There is no too late with God," Padre Pio said. Thomas frowned. He was a rational man. Time moved forward, not backward. "We live in time," the friar explained, tapping his chest. "God does not. To him, everything is a single present moment." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "The Hail Mary you offer now becomes a grace placed into the moment God chooses." Thomas stared at him. The implication was staggering. It meant that a prayer offered today could ripple backward to comfort a soldier in a trench 5 years ago. It meant that the timeline of grace was not linear. Padre Pio continued, his voice taking on a poetic rhythm. "Do not worry about your lost time. Give it to the Virgin. She is the treasurer." "The treasurer," Thomas repeated. He liked the word. It implied value. It implied that nothing was discarded. Padre Pio described Our Lady as the treasurer of forgotten prayers. He said she keeps every Hail Mary like a jewel. "Think of it, Thomas," the friar said. "A mother does not throw away the drawings of her child, even if they are scribbles. She keeps them." He closed his eyes for a moment. "She collects them. She knows when to use them." Thomas imagined a vast, invisible treasury. In this place, there were no bank accounts or gold bars. There were only whispers. There were the Hail Marys said by children in the dark. There were the pleas of mothers by hospital beds. There were the distracted prayers of tired men like himself. "And when the moment comes," Pio said, opening his eyes, "she uses those stored prayers to save a soul who believed themselves lost." Thomas felt a great weight lift from his shoulders. He realized he did not need to understand the mechanics of eternity. He only needed to trust the banker. Padre Pio even said that some souls receive the grace of final repentance because of Hail Marys prayed decades earlier by parents, grandparents, or even strangers. This meant that Pietro, the bitter old man, might have been saved not just by the prayer of Padre Pio that afternoon, but by a prayer his own mother had said over his cradle 50 years ago. The Virgin had held that prayer, waiting for the precise second when Pietro's heart was ready to break. "Grace is not lost," Pio said firmly. "It is only waiting." Thomas left the sacristy and walked out into the cool evening air. The sky was filled with stars. For the first time in years, the vastness of the universe did not make him feel small and insignificant. It made him feel connected. He took out his rosary. He held the crucifix in his hand. He thought of Michael, his friend who had died in the mud of France. He had not prayed for Michael then. He had been too busy surviving. "Hail Mary, full of grace," Thomas whispered. He offered the prayer not for the present but for the past. He asked the treasurer to take this small jewel and place it in the pocket of a frightened soldier in 1944. He walked down the hill, the beads clicking softly in his hand. He understood now. He was not just a reporter observing a story. He was a contributor to the treasury. And in the economy of heaven, even the smallest coin was enough to buy a miracle. Padre Pio would repeat, "Do not underestimate the smallest prayer. In heaven, nothing is small." Thomas sat in the small courtyard of the monastery, watching the shadows lengthen across the stone pavers. The concept of time had always been a rigid line for him. There was the past, which was unchangeable and often painful. There was the present, which was fleeting. And there was the future, which was uncertain. He looked at the watch on his wrist. It was a mechanical device, ticking away seconds that would never return. For Thomas, the war was in the past. The friends he had lost were in the past. He believed that their stories had ended the moment they fell. But the conversations he had been having with the friars were beginning to fracture this certainty. That afternoon, Thomas found an opportunity to speak with Padre Pio again. The friar was resting on a wooden bench near the rose bushes, his face turned toward the setting Sunday. He looked peaceful, but his fingers were still moving over the beads of his rosary. Thomas approached carefully. "Father," Thomas said, keeping his voice low, "I have a question that troubles me." Padre Pio opened his eyes. They were dark and deep, holding a kind of ancient patience. "Ask my son," the friar replied. Thomas sat on the edge of the stone planter nearby. "You speak of prayer saving souls," Thomas began. "You say that the Hail Mary can help those who have died. But what if I pray too late?" Padre Pio tilted his head slightly. "Too late?" he asked. "Yes," Thomas said. "My friends died years ago. The war is over. If I pray for them now, in 1947, how can it help them in 1944? The moment of their death has already passed. They have already been judged." Thomas felt the weight of his logic. It seemed airtight. You could not mail a letter to a house that had already burned down. Padre Pio smiled. It was a smile of profound compassion, the kind a teacher gives a student who is struggling with a difficult lesson. "You are thinking like a man who lives in a river," Padre Pio said. "A river?" Thomas asked. "Yes. You are in the water, flowing downstream. You see the water that has passed you, and you call it the past. You see the water ahead, and you call it the future. You cannot touch the water that has already flowed by." The friar raised his hand and pointed to the sky. "But God does not live in the river, Thomas. God sits on the bank. He sees the whole river at once. He sees the source, the middle, and the ocean, all in a single glance." Thomas looked up at the sky. The clouds were turning pink and gold. Padre Pio continued, his voice becoming more intense. "There is no too late with God. To him, everything is a single present moment. The division of time is a limit for us, not for him." He leaned forward, looking directly into the eyes of Thomas. "The Hail Mary you offer now, in this garden, becomes a grace placed into the moment God chooses." Thomas felt a sudden disorientation. "You mean," Thomas stammered, "my prayer today can go back?" Padre Pio nodded. "We live in time," he said. "God does not. The prayer you offer today is present to God eternally. He can take the grace of that prayer and apply it to the moment your friend was dying, 3 years ago." The friar paused, letting the words sink in. "Perhaps your friend felt a sudden peace in his final moment," Padre Pio whispered. "Perhaps he felt a comfort he could not explain. He did not know where it came from. But it came from you, praying right here, right now." Thomas stared at his hands. He had always lived with the regret that he had done nothing for Michael in those final, chaotic seconds. He had thought he was helpless. "Your prayer today can save a soul yesterday," Padre Pio said firmly. The man stared at him, stunned. The logic of the world said that the past was dead. The logic of Padre Pio said that the past was merely a room in the house of God, and prayer was the key that could open the door. To him, the Hail Mary was a kind of spiritual currency, something Mary could spend wherever it was most needed. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. "So, no prayer is wasted?" Thomas asked, his voice thick with emotion. "No prayer was ever wasted," Padre Pio answered. "No prayer was ever small. No prayer ever failed." He picked up his rosary again. "Give your prayers to the Mother," he said. "She knows the timeline better than you. She will place them where they belong." Thomas sat in the garden until the sun went down completely. The air turned cold, but he did not feel it. He was thinking about Michael. He closed his eyes and began to pray. He did not pray with the desperation of a man trying to change history. He prayed with the confidence of a man who knew that history was held in the hands of a timeless God. Hail Mary, full of grace. He sent the prayer out into the night, trusting that it would find its way upstream, against the current of time, to the moment where it was needed most. The monastery at San Giovanni Rotondo had a different rhythm than the rest of the world. While the village below slept, the spiritual life of the friary was often at its most intense. It was 4 in the morning. The hallways were dark, lit only by the faint glow of the sanctuary lamp from the chapel. Brother Leo was walking toward the choir for the early morning prayers. He was a young man, still adjusting to the austere life of the Capuchins, but he possessed a heart that was eager to see the mysteries of God. As he approached the entrance to the choir, he stopped. Padre Pio was already there. The older friar was standing by the window that looked out over the valley. He was not kneeling. He was standing completely still, his rosary dangling from his hand. His posture was rigid, attentive, like a sentry on a watchtower. Brother Leo hesitated. He did not want to disturb the holy man. But there was something about the atmosphere in the room that drew him in. The air felt charged, vibrant, as if the stone walls were vibrating with a low-frequency hum. Brother Leo stepped closer. He saw that the eyes of Padre Pio were open, but he was not looking at anything in the room. His gaze was fixed on something beyond the glass, beyond the dark hills of the Gargano. It was as if he were staring through the walls into another world. "Father," Brother Leo whispered, "are you all right?" Padre Pio blinked slowly. He seemed to return from a great distance. He turned his head slightly toward the young friar, but he did not smile. His expression was one of awe and solemnity. "Do not disturb them," Padre Pio whispered. Brother Leo looked around the empty room. "Disturb who, Father?" he asked, confused. Padre Pio turned back to the window. "The souls," he replied. "The ones freed by the Hail Marys prayed this morning. They are rising." Brother Leo moved to the side of the older priest. He looked out into the darkness. He saw only the night and the faint outline of the cypress trees. "I do not see them, Father," Leo confessed. Padre Pio placed a hand on the shoulder of the young man. His grip was firm, warm, and grounding. He described what he saw. He said he saw them like sparks rising through a veil of mist. "They are moving upward," Padre Pio said softly, painting the picture for the younger man. "Some are moving slowly, heavy with the dust of their journey. Some are moving quickly, like arrows of light." Brother Leo closed his eyes, trying to visualize the image. "They are carried by a light that feels almost like wind," Pio continued, "and standing among them is the Virgin Mary." "The Virgin?" Leo asked. "Yes. She is gathering them gently, guiding them upward. She takes each one by the hand, not because they deserve it, but because someone remembered them." The friar explained that when people pray the Hail Mary for the souls who have no one to pray for them, heaven reacts immediately. Brother Leo opened his eyes. He looked at the rosary in the hand of Padre Pio. It looked different to him now. It was not just a tool for counting, it was a mechanism for release. "Their suffering is shortened," Padre Pio said. "Their longing becomes hope. The prayer becomes a bridge under their feet." For the rest of the morning, Brother Leo could not shake the image from his mind. He thought of the sparks rising in the dark. He realized that the world was much more crowded than it appeared. There were the living, walking on the earth, and there were the dead, waiting in the mist. Later that day, Thomas interviewed Brother Leo. The journalist listened intently as the young friar described the scene in the choir. "He saw them rising?" Thomas asked, his pen hovering over the page. "Yes," Leo said, "like sparks from a fire." Thomas thought about the physics of a spark. It was a small, hot particle that defied gravity for a brief moment, rising toward the sky before it faded. Padre Pio said that Mary is never still, Leo added. Whenever someone calls her, she runs. She is busy gathering these sparks. Thomas looked out the window of the library. The sun was high now, bleaching the landscape with white light. But in his mind, he saw the night. He saw the invisible vertical traffic that connected the earth to heaven. He realized that the prayers he had been saying were part of that updraft. Every Hail Mary was a breath of wind that helped a spark rise higher. To Padre Pio, this was not poetic language, Thomas wrote in his notes. He saw it. Thomas understood then that the isolation of death was an illusion. There was a constant communion, a continuous exchange of aid, powered by the simple, rhythmic engine of the Hail Mary. The heat in southern Italy could be relentless. By midday, the sun turned the rocky landscape around San Giovanni Rotondo into an oven. The earth cracked. The olive trees twisted their branches as if wringing their hands in thirst. The dust coated everything in a layer of fine, gray powder. Thomas sat in the shade of the church portico, wiping sweat from his forehead. He was watching a line of pilgrims waiting to enter the church. They looked tired. They held water bottles, fanning themselves with hats and newspapers. The physical sensation of thirst was everywhere. It was on this day that Padre Pio spoke to Thomas about the nature of purgatory. Thomas had expected descriptions of fire and torment, images drawn from old medieval paintings. But Padre Pio, as always, brought the mystery down to a level that was visceral and human. Thomas was allowed to sit in the corner of the sacristy while Padre Pio instructed a spiritual daughter named Francesca. She was a woman who had lost her husband and was consumed with worry about his soul. "Father, is he in pain?" Francesca asked, her voice trembling. Padre Pio looked at her with deep tenderness. He did not dismiss her fear. "My daughter," he said, "you must understand what the pain is." He gestured toward the window, toward the baking heat outside. He described purgatory as a place of dryness, a burning hunger for the presence of God. "It is like a desert," Padre Pio explained. "The soul has seen God for a fleeting moment at judgment, and then, because it is not yet ready, it must wait. The soul burns with the desire to return to that face. It is a thirst of the heart that is greater than any thirst of the body." Thomas listened, fascinated. This was not a God of torture. This was a God of attraction. The suffering came from the delay of love, not the infliction of violence. "The soul waits," Pio said. "It longs. The time feels like an eternity because the desire is so great." Then, the friar leaned forward and took the hands of the woman. "But you have water," he said. "Ido?" Francesca asked. "Your prayers," Pio answered. He once told a spiritual daughter, "When you pray for someone who has died, your words fall on them like dew in the desert." Thomas closed his eyes. He imagined the dry, cracked earth he had seen outside. He imagined the cool, gentle touch of morning dew settling on the dust. It was a relief. It was a softening. "A single Hail Mary," Pio said, "is like giving them water that tastes of heaven." Francesca began to weep, but they were tears of relief. She realized she was not helpless. She could do something. She could alleviate the thirst of her husband. "Every time you say the prayer, you cool the longing," Pio continued. "You wash away the dust that keeps him from God." Thomas looked at his own notebook. He had written, "Prayer is water." This metaphor changed everything for him. He had often thought of prayer as a duty, a dry recitation of words. But if prayer was water, then it was the most precious substance in the universe. Padre Pio taught that the dead cannot pray for themselves in the same way we can. They can only wait. They are beggars in the desert. But the living, Thomas realized, are the water carriers. The living have the power to draw water from the well of grace and pour it out for those who are thirsty. After the woman left, Thomas remained in the cool silence of the sacristy. He thought about the responsibility that came with this knowledge. If he knew that a man was dying of thirst outside the door, and he had a cup of water, it would be a crime not to give it to him. Was it any different for the soul? Thomas stood up and walked over to the holy water font near the door. He dipped his finger in the cool liquid and made the sign of the cross. He thought of the dry souls. He thought of the sparks waiting to rise. "Hail Mary, full of grace," he whispered. He visualized the prayer not as a sound, but as a silver drop of rain falling into a dry, vast place. He hoped that somewhere, in the mystery of God, a soul felt the coolness and looked up, knowing they were not forgotten. To Padre Pio, the connection was physical, tangible, and real. The Hail Mary was the vessel that carried the water of life across the barrier of death. The silence of the monastery at night was heavy and absolute. It was a silence that did not just fill the ears but seemed to press against the skin. Thomas had difficulty sleeping. The questions he had been asking himself about faith and the afterlife kept him awake, staring at the cracked plaster of his ceiling. One night, unable to rest, he dressed and walked quietly to the church. He knew the friars often prayed in the early hours, and he hoped to find some peace in the presence of the sanctuary lamp. As he walked down the long stone corridor that led to the choir, he heard a sound. It was not the chanting of psalms, it was the sound of weeping. Thomas stopped. He peered into the shadows. Standing near the entrance to the choir was Padre Pio. The old friar was leaning against the wall, his hand pressed firmly over his heart. His shoulders were shaking. A young friar, Brother Michael, ran to him from the other end of the hallway. Thomas stayed back, hidden in the gloom, witnessing the scene. "Father, what is happening?" Brother Michael whispered urgently, reaching out to support the older man. "Are you in pain?" Padre Pio shook his head. He took a deep, shuddering breath and looked at the young friar with eyes that were swimming with tears. "A soul has just entered paradise," Padre Pio whispered. Thomas felt the air in the hallway shift. He expected the friar to say it was a great bishop or a holy martyr. "Who was it, Father?" Brother Michael asked. Padre Pio wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his habit. It was because of a Hail Mary prayed by a poor old woman who thought she had nothing to offer. Thomas leaned against the cold stone wall. He thought of the theologians he had read in university, men who wrote thick books about the nature of grace and the mechanics of salvation. He thought of the great cathedrals built with gold and marble. And here was Padre Pio, claiming that the gates of heaven had just been swung open not by a papal decree, but by the whisper of an unknown woman. Then he added, "Heaven bends down lower for the humblest voices." Thomas wrote that phrase in his mind. Heaven bends down lower. It suggested a reversal of gravity. In the world Thomas knew, the powerful stood at the top and the weak stood at the bottom. But in the vision of Padre Pio, the hierarchy was inverted. The heavy weight of pride kept a soul on the ground, while the lightness of humility allowed it to rise. He believed deeply that the poor, the lonely, the forgotten, those who pray with simple faith, often release more souls from purgatory than theologians or scholars. Padre Pio straightened up. He looked tired, but the sorrow in his face had been replaced by a radiant peace. "God listens to the heart," he said to Brother Michael, "and the heart speaks most clearly in the Hail Mary." Thomas retreated back to his room before he could be seen. He sat on the edge of his bed. He realized that he had been trying to understand God with his intellect, like a man trying to catch the wind in a net. But the old woman had understood God with her need. She had simply asked. He thought of the millions of people in the world who felt insignificant. He thought of the soldiers who had died in unmarked graves. Padre Pio was saying that in the vast, invisible economy of God, these were the voices that commanded the attention of angels. The health of Padre Pio was always fragile, a constant battle between his spirit and his failing body. As the winter months set in, a damp cold settled over San Giovanni Rotondo, and the friar fell ill. He was confined to his cell for several days. Thomas, through his connection with Brother Leo, was allowed to sit quietly in the room for a short time while the doctors attended to the friar. The cell was stark, a simple bed, a crucifix, a chair, but the atmosphere was not one of sickness. It was one of intense activity. Even lying in bed, Padre Pio seemed to be working. His fingers, as always, were moving over the beads. The doctor, a kind man from the village, was checking the pulse of the friar. "Father, you must rest," the doctor said gently. "You are exhausted." Padre Pio smiled weakly. His voice was a rasp, barely audible. "I am visiting," he whispered. "Visiting?" the doctor asked. "You are here in bed, Father." "I am visiting the hospital," Pio answered. Thomas looked up from his notebook. He knew there was a hospital nearby, the home for the relief of suffering, which Pio was building. But Pio was not talking about a building made of bricks. He described seeing the Virgin Mary walking through purgatory like a mother walking through a hospital, he said. The image took hold of the imagination of Thomas. He saw the rows of beds, the suffering patients, the quiet urgency of a ward at night. "She touches the wounds of her children," Pio continued, his eyes closed. "She does not look at their sins, she looks at their pain." He even described seeing her bending over certain souls almost the way a mother bends over a child in bed. Thomas thought of the comfort of a mother. It was a comfort that did not require words. It was a presence that said, "I am here." "And what does she give them?" Thomas asked, breaking his silence. Padre Pio turned his head on the pillow to look at Thomas. "And every time she was holding something," he said, "the rosaries and Hail Marys offered by the living." He lifted his own rosary slightly. "She carries them like bread," Padre Pio said, "and she feeds the souls with them." Thomas stared at the beads in the hand of the sick man. Bread, the most basic necessity of life. In the spiritual realm, prayer was not a luxury, it was nutrition. The souls were starving for God, and the Hail Mary was the sustenance that gave them the strength to endure the purification. He insisted that Mary's greatest joy is bringing souls to her Son, especially souls who believed they were unworthy. "She takes the prayers we give her," he said, "and makes them beautiful." Thomas left the cell that day with a profound sense of responsibility. If prayer was bread, then failing to pray was an act of starvation. It was to leave the souls hungry when the granary was full. He walked down to the village church and sat in the back. He began to pray the rosary, not for himself, but for the unknown dead. He visualized himself handing loaves of bread to the Virgin, watching her walk into the gray mists of the hospital to feed those who could not feed themselves. A week later, Thomas received a letter from America. He opened it with trembling hands, fearing bad news about his sister who had been ill. He read the words quickly, then he read them again. His sister had made a sudden, inexplicable recovery. The doctors were baffled. She was out of the hospital and back home. Thomas sat on the stone bench in the monastery garden, holding the letter. He felt a wave of relief so strong it made him dizzy. He looked up at the sky. He had been praying for her, yes, but he had also been praying for the dead, for Michael, for the souls in purgatory. Later, he found Padre Pio sitting in the sun, looking stronger than he had in days. Thomas sat beside him and shared the good news. "It is a stroke of luck," Thomas said, smiling. "A wonderful coincidence." Padre Pio shook his head, his expression serious but kind. "There is no luck, Thomas. There is only grace." He looked at the letter in the hand of the journalist. "Do you think you are the only one who has been praying?" Pio asked. Thomas frowned. "My family prayed, of course," he said. Padre Pio gestured toward the cemetery down the hill. Padre Pio often spoke of the mysterious exchange of graces that happens after we die. He said that souls who reach heaven because of our Hail Marys become protectors of our families. Thomas looked at the cemetery. He thought of the Hail Marys he had offered for the forgotten souls over the last few weeks. "They intercede day and night," Pio said. "Their gratitude is like a river." "You mean," Thomas asked slowly, "because I helped them, they helped me?" Padre Pio nodded. Once a woman grieving her child came to him and asked, "Father, if my child is in heaven, will he help me?" Pio recounted the story to Thomas. "I answered her, he already has. He is praying for your family because you prayed for him. Heaven remembers." Thomas looked back at the letter. The recovery of his sister no longer felt like a random event. It felt like a payment. It felt like a response from an invisible army he had befriended. He believed this mutual exchange between earth and heaven was one of God's greatest gifts. "We are never alone," Pio said, placing his hand on the arm of Thomas. "Every Hail Mary ties us to someone waiting for us in eternity." Thomas realized that the church was not a collection of isolated individuals. It was a vast, interconnected web. A prayer said in Italy could save a soul in purgatory. That soul, upon entering heaven, could obtain a grace for a woman in America. The circle was unbroken. He felt a sudden, deep connection to Michael, his fallen friend. He felt that Michael was not gone. He was active. He was part of this exchange. Thomas folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He took out his rosary. He did not say a word to Padre Pio. He just began to pray. And this time, he prayed with the certainty that he was speaking into a radio that was transmitting to 1,000 listening stations, all of them eager to answer back with love. The years moved over San Giovanni Rotondo like the shadows of clouds passing over the mountain. It was now 1968. The small, quiet monastery that Thomas had visited 2 decades earlier had vanished. In its place stood a sprawling complex, surrounded by hotels, souvenir shops, and a massive new church. The silence of the 1940s had been replaced by the hum of thousands of pilgrims. Thomas walked through the crowds. His hair was gray now, and he walked with a cane, the legacy of an old war injury that had flared up with age. He felt a strange sense of dislocation. The world had changed. It was louder, faster, and more chaotic. The newspapers back in America were full of stories about riots, revolutions, and a new generation that seemed to be tearing down every tradition they could find. But here, in this remote corner of Italy, the center still held. Thomas made his way to the old church. It was packed with people. There were women in black veils, men in business suits, sick children in wheelchairs, and curious tourists with cameras. They were all waiting for one thing. They were waiting for the old friar to say the Mass. When Padre Pio finally appeared, a hush fell over the crowd. He was 81 years old now. He was bent over, his body ravaged by 50 years of bearing the wounds. He needed the support of 2 other friars just to walk to the altar. Thomas watched him from a reserved seat near the front. He saw the trembling hands. He saw the face that was etched with a lifetime of suffering. But what struck him most was the chain. Every person in the church was holding a rosary. Thomas looked around. He saw thousands of hands, old and young, clutching the beads. It looked like a single, continuous chain that wound its way through the pews, out the doors, and down the mountain. Later that afternoon, Thomas sat with Brother Leo, who was now a senior friar with silver hair. They sat in a quiet room in the monastery, away from the noise of the crowds. "It has become a city," Thomas said, gesturing toward the window. "It has become a fortress," Brother Leo corrected him gently. "A fortress?" Thomas asked. Brother Leo nodded. "Padre Pio believes that the world is entering a time of great darkness," Leo said. "He calls the rosary the spiritual instrument of these times. He says that every Hail Mary is a link in a chain that binds the earth to heaven." Thomas thought about the chaotic world outside. He thought about the confusion and the fear that seemed to grip so many people. "He says that the prayer changes the world invisibly," Leo continued. "You cannot see it, Thomas. But every time the prayer is spoken, something moves in the invisible realm." "What moves?" Thomas asked. "A soul receives comfort," Leo said. "An angel receives strength. A heart receives light." He leaned forward. "Padre Pio told us yesterday that without these prayers, the world would have already collapsed under the weight of its own sins. He believes that the chain of rosaries is the only thing holding the sky in place." Thomas looked at his own rosary, worn smooth by years of use. He had often wondered if his prayers made a difference. Sometimes, the world seemed too big and too broken for a string of beads to matter. But looking at the old friar, who was now resting in his cell, Thomas realized that size did not matter. The atom was small, yet it held the power to destroy cities. The Hail Mary was small, yet Padre Pio believed it held the power to save them. Thomas wrote in his journal that evening. He wrote that he had seen the unbreaking chain. It was not made of iron or steel. It was made of whispers. And as long as there were voices to whisper the words, the chain would hold. The body of Padre Pio was failing. The doctors who attended him were constantly amazed that he was still alive. He could barely eat. His breathing was labored. The wounds on his hands and feet caused him constant throbbing pain. One evening, late in September, the situation became critical. Padre Pio collapsed in the hallway after saying the rosary with a group of pilgrims. The friars carried him to his cell and laid him on the bed. The doctor was summoned immediately. He checked the vital signs of the old man and shook his head. "He is exhausted," the doctor told the superior of the monastery. "His heart is weak. He needs absolute rest. No visitors. No confessions. And above all, he must stop praying so intensely. He is using up energy he does not have." Thomas was waiting in the corridor outside the cell. He heard the instructions of the doctor. He knew that asking Padre Pio to stop praying was like asking a fish to stop swimming. A few minutes later, the doctor came out looking frustrated. Brother Leo beckoned Thomas to the door. "He wants to speak to you," Leo whispered. Thomas entered the cell. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp. Padre Pio lay on the bed, his face pale against the white pillow. His eyes were closed, but his fingers were moving. "Hail Mary, Hail Mary." The whisper was barely audible. It was a dry, scratching sound. The doctor sat by the bedside, pleading softly. "Father, please," the doctor said. You must sleep. You must let your mind rest. If you continue, your heart will stop. Padre Pio opened his eyes. They were cloudy with age, yet they still held that piercing blue light. How can I rest? The friar asked, his voice trembling. Because you are human, Father, the doctor replied. Even the machine needs to stop. Padre Pio shook his head slowly on the pillow. If I stop, a soul may wait longer for light, he whispered. He looked at the ceiling, as if seeing the faces of the waiting souls. And if one Hail Mary can shorten that waiting, how can I rest? The doctor sighed, defeated. He looked at Thomas, as if asking for help. Thomas stepped closer to the bed. Father, Thomas said gently, even the sun sets. Padre Pio turned his gaze to Thomas. A faint smile touched his lips. But the mother does not set, Pio said. He took a shallow breath. Our Lady never sleeps, he whispered. The phrase hung in the room. Our Lady never sleeps. Padre Pio believed that the Virgin was constantly active. She was constantly searching. She was constantly visiting souls with the prayers entrusted to her. If she does not sleep, Pio said, closing his eyes again, then I cannot sleep. I must give her the bread to carry. He returned to his rhythm. The beads clicked softly. Hail Mary, Hail Mary. Thomas backed away. He realized that this was not stubbornness. This was love. It was a love so total, so consuming, that it overrode the instinct for self-preservation. Padre Pio was praying with his final strength, giving his remaining energy to strangers he would never meet in this life. Thomas left the room, leaving the doctor to watch over the dying saint. He walked out into the night air. He looked up at the stars. He imagined the Virgin Mary moving through the universe, sleepless and tireless, carrying the prayers of the old man like a basket of food to the hungry. 2 days before he died, Padre Pio sat in his chair. He was unable to lie down because of his breathing. His hands were shaking so violently that he could no longer hold the rosary beads. The friars had to help him. One friar sat on his right and another on his left. They held his hands. They moved the beads through his fingers for him, guiding his touch so he could feel the prayer. Thomas was granted one final audience. He knew this would be the last time he saw the man who had changed his life. He entered the cell and knelt beside the chair. Padre Pio looked at him. The recognition was slow, but it was there. Thomas, the friar whispered. Father, Thomas said, I have one last question. Padre Pio nodded slightly. You have prayed millions of Hail Marys, Thomas said. You have built a hospital, you have healed the sick. But at the end of everything, what is the Hail Mary to you? The room was silent. The only sound was the labored breathing of the old man. Padre Pio closed his eyes. He seemed to be searching for the right words, sifting through a lifetime of theology and experience. When he opened his eyes, they were clear. It is the key, he said. The key to what? Thomas asked. It is the key to mercy, Pio answered. He tried to lift his hand, but it was too heavy. It opens doors no one else can open, he whispered. Thomas thought of the doors he had seen in his life. The steel doors of bunkers, the locked doors of secrets, the heavy doors of regret. When a person dies, Pio said, his voice gaining a sudden strength, the Hail Marys they prayed throughout their life become like lanterns. Lanterns? Thomas asked. Yes, they light the path, they guide the soul through fear, they comfort the soul in judgment, they embrace the soul in hope. He looked at Thomas with intense urgency. And for the souls still waiting for heaven, he said, the Hail Mary is like sunrise. Thomas wrote the word sunrise in his heart. He did not need his notebook anymore. Padre Pio described purgatory one last time. He described it not as a place of terror, but as a place where time feels like longing. And heaven, he said, is a place where longing becomes fulfillment. And between the two? Thomas asked. Between the two stands Mary, Pio said softly. She carries all the forgotten prayers of the faithful. She uses the key to open the gate. The friar closed his eyes. He was fading again. The energy required to speak was gone. Thomas stood up. He placed his hand on the trembling hand of the friar. Thank you, Father, Thomas whispered. Padre Pio did not answer. He had already returned to his work. His lips were moving. The friars beside him began to move the beads through his fingers again. Hail Mary! Hail Mary! Thomas walked out of the cell. He felt a profound sense of peace. He knew that the key was not made of gold, it was not made of iron. It was made of simple words, accessible to a child, accessible to a soldier, accessible to a dying old man. It was a key that anyone could turn, and once turned, it opened a door that death itself could not close. The end came not like a storm, but like the fading of a long summer day. The monastery was quiet, but it was a silence filled with presence, not absence. The friars walked softly in the corridors, speaking in hushed tones, aware that a great soul was preparing to leave the earth. Thomas sat in the small chapel near the cell of Padre Pio. He had spent the last 20 years writing about wars, politics, and the noisy revolutions of the world. But sitting here, in the shadow of a dying old man, those things seemed incredibly distant. Brother Leo came to find him. The friar looked weary, his eyes rimmed with red, but his spirit was calm. "He is speaking again," Leo whispered. Thomas followed the friar back to the cell. The room was crowded with the invisible. The air felt thin, as if the veil between this world and the next had been worn down to a single thread. Padre Pio was propped up on pillows. His breathing was shallow. The famous wounds on his hands, which had been open for 50 years, were disappearing. The skin was closing up, leaving no scars, a final sign that his earthly mission of suffering was ending. Thomas stood at the foot of the bed. He watched the face of the saint. It was no longer twisted in pain. It was smoothing out, returning to the innocence of a child. Padre Pio opened his eyes and looked at the window. It was night outside, pitch black, but he seemed to be seeing a light that no one else could see. "The sunrise," Pio whispered. The doctor leaned in, checking the pulse. "It is night, Father," the doctor said gently. Padre Pio shook his head slowly. "For the souls," he breathed. "The Hail Mary is like sunrise." Thomas remembered the conversation they had days ago. The friar had described purgatory as a place of longing, a long night where the soul waits for the morning. He realized that Padre Pio was not talking about the sun that rises over the mountains of Italy. He was talking about the spiritual illumination that comes when a soul is finally released from its waiting. He described purgatory as a place where time feels like longing, Thomas recalled from his notes, and heaven as a place where longing becomes fulfillment. And between the two, Padre Pio whispered, his voice gaining a momentary strength, "Stands Mary." He moved his hand, as if reaching for something he could not quite grasp. "She is carrying them," he said. "All the forgotten prayers. She is bringing the morning." Thomas looked at the rosary on the bedside table. It lay there, coiled like a lifeline that had been pulled in. The work was almost done. The rope had been thrown, the knots had been tied, and the souls had been pulled to shore. Padre Pio looked at the friars gathered around him. "Do not stop," he told them. "The sun must rise for everyone." He was leaving them with a final instruction. The mission was not ending with his death. The sunrise was a continuous event, happening every time a prayer was offered with love. Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had come to San Giovanni Rotondo looking for a story about a miracle worker. He was leaving with a map of the cosmos. He understood now that the universe was not a cold, empty void. It was a place where love could travel through time, where a whisper could break chains, and where a mother was always waiting to bring the dawn. The hours of the night ticked by. The clock on the wall marked the time, but inside the cell, time seemed to have stopped. It was the 23rd of September, 1968. Padre Pio sat in his armchair, dressed in his habit. He had asked to die sitting up, facing the struggle until the very end. His breath came in short, difficult gasps. The friars knelt around him, their prayers filling the room with a soft, rhythmic murmuring. Thomas stood near the door, a witness to the final passage. The room was devoid of fear. There was sadness, yes, but it was the sadness of a family saying goodbye to a father who was going on a long journey. Padre Pio began to speak, but he was no longer speaking to the men in the room. He was speaking to someone else. "Hail Mary," he whispered. It was faint, like the rustle of dry leaves. "Hail Mary." He repeated the words over and over. He was not asking for anything anymore. He was not teaching. He was simply holding the hand of the guide who had walked with him for 81 years. The friars stopped their own prayers to listen. They heard the same words that the soldier had screamed on the battlefield. They heard the same words that the child had whispered for her mother. They heard the same words that the old woman had offered in the dark. It was the last prayer he ever said. The prayer he believed could save anyone. The prayer he believed could change eternity. Suddenly, Padre Pio stopped. His eyes opened wide. He looked at a point in the room that was empty to everyone else. A look of absolute recognition washed over his face. It was a look of surprise, and then of total joy. He murmured the names of Jesus and Mary one last time, and then he was gone. His head fell forward on his chest. The doctor moved forward, but there was nothing to do. The machine had stopped. The soul had launched. Thomas stepped out into the corridor. The hallway was silent, but in his mind, he could hear the sound described by Brother Leo years ago. He could hear the sound of sparks rising. He imagined the soul of the old friar rising through the mist, not alone but surrounded by thousands of others. He imagined the soldiers, the mothers, the sinners, and the forgotten ones, all forming a guard of honor, all of them saved by the simple rhythmic work of the rosary. He walked out of the monastery and into the cool night air. The stars were brilliant above the Gargano mountains. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out his own rosary. He held the crucifix in his hand. He looked back at the window of the cell where the saint had just died. He did not say a eulogy. He did not make a speech. He simply did what he had been taught. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." He whispered the words into the darkness. And somewhere, in the vast, invisible treasury of heaven, a new coin was dropped, ready to be spent on a soul who was waiting for the sunrise. If you take one thing away from this story, let it be this: do not underestimate your own voice. You may feel that you are too weak to pray. You may feel that you have been away from God for too long. You may feel that your words are empty. But remember the teaching of Padre Pio. He said that grace is not measured by the quality of your words, but by the sincerity of your need. Do not wait until you feel holy to pray. Pray especially when you feel weak. That is when your prayer is most powerful, because that is when it is most honest. Think of the Hail Mary not as a religious obligation, but as a rope. When you are drowning in anxiety or fear or grief, you do not need to explain yourself to the rope. You just need to grab it. So tonight, whether you are full of faith or full of doubt, whisper one prayer. Offer it for someone you have lost, or for a stranger who has no one to remember them. Trust that your whisper will not vanish into the void. It will be caught, it will be kept, and one day, it might be the very thing that brings the sunrise. If you enjoyed this story, please support the channel by clicking the like button and subscribing for more biblical journeys. I would love to read your thoughts and reflections in the comment section below. Remember that no shadow is deep enough to hide you from the light. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.